Welcome back to the Public Service Commission. We are still on rebuttal testimony of the Duke Energy Company as to their integrated resource plan in South Carolina. All commissioners are present in the courtroom, and all participating parties seem to be here and represented. Before we start back, I did some thinking. I just wanted to clarify my earlier ruling today regarding the letter that was filed by Duke on September 11, 2024. I looked at it earlier today. What I did was I took judicial notice of the fact that the Duke letter was filed in the commission's docket, which means docket management system, not the contents of the letter. And according to the commission regulations 103-846C, notice can be taken of judicially cognizable facts. Rule 201, the rules of evidence set forth that judicially noticed facts must be one not subject to reasonable dispute and that is either generally known within the territorial jurisdiction of the trial court or capable of accurate and ready determination by resort to sources whose accuracy cannot reasonably be questioned. Under South Carolina law, judicial notice means the trial judge will admit evidence considered without proof of the facts, matters of common and general knowledge. And that's the Moss case, which some of you may be familiar with. The test is whether sufficient notoriety attaches to the fact involved as to make it proper to assume its existence without proof. Simply put, the letter is not something that the commission can take judicial note of, as it is not proper to assume the contents of the letter as evidence without proof. So the letter itself, judicial notice, is in our system. But as far as what's in the letter, of course, it is not what I was taking judicial notice of. It appears the contents of the letter would fall into would not fall into the category of judicial notice, although it is filed in the docket. I just want to make it clear to everybody what's in that letter is not evidence in the record.
Mr. Chairman, may I be heard? Thank you for that. Understood the chair's ruling. We had a brief opportunity to discuss that over lunch as well, and having additional time to consider it and recognizing that we did establish a foundation with Mr. Snyder as to the contents of the letter. We just want to ask the chair to reconsider whether it would be appropriate to have this be a hearing exhibit. You made the comment earlier that Mr. Welburn signed the letter and would be sponsoring it, but it's not pre-filed testimony. It is a document which had at least as much foundation as this S&P news article that was presented earlier. So we continue to think that it is appropriate. We've established a foundation for it, and it could be entered into the record as a hearing exhibit, even if it's not presented as pre-filed testimony, which I didn't. If I made that representation, that wasn't the intent.
Well, you can proffer the letter, but anytime it's I didn't even get into Rule 401 or 403 of the Rules of Evidence. It's confusion, misleading. There's several reasons that I feel that the contents are not admissible at this time.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Still with us?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All
Hopefully
right.
you're with me. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Just briefly before I get started back, I did find those extra copies. If they were a snake, they would have bit me. So I've passed those out for this order. And then just one quick housekeeping item I wanted to mention. Mr. Torrey reminded me. For this panel, we have attempted to split the panel. Mr. Torrey will have just a couple of questions for Mr. Snyder once I'm finished. Just want to note that. I don't believe I've asked Mr. Snyder any questions. I believe he has responded to a couple, but I don't believe I asked him a question. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Quinto, back with you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And I do think I was able to trim this down a little bit, so we're going to try and keep going. I'd like to turn your attention back to this is page 4 of that order 2023-189. And this is paragraph 6A of the findings. One of those recommendations that was found was to continue to model both company-owned and power purchase agreement solar as selectable resource options and not arbitrarily limit the selection of PPA solar resources. Is that what the company did with its planning portfolio for the IRP report?
Not sure what you mean by planning portfolio. The companies did address this commission requirement in the IRP.
Okay, and how did they address it?
We developed a portfolio where a purchase power agreement solar was a selectable resource. It did not have arbitrary limitations. It could select up to the solar availability limit for that resource. It was included in the initial plan as a supplemental portfolio, and I believe this is also noted in appendix and the cross-reference in our IRB.
Okay, and so you ran a supplemental portfolio where the model selected PPA. How many portfolios did you run in the entirety of this process?
53 portfolios across the initial plan, the supplemental planning analysis, and the portfolios contained within my rebuttal exhibit.
Did those additional portfolios, all but this one, do they treat the portfolio as company-owned solar?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to my testimony where I kind of describe the usage of the terms company-owned and PPA, if I could.
Sure. If you could just direct me to the page, I'll follow along with you.
Once I find it, I will let you know. Okay, it's the section beginning on page 12.
Okay.
And on the following pages, I describe briefly the ORS recommendation and how the companies think about, or how this modeling difference has come about between company-owned and PPA ownership of solar. What this really comes down to is the accounting methodology used to spread the cost of that resource out over time. So the way that the companies model all resources as a base planning assumption is a capital cost input to the resource model, the capacity expansion model. The model assesses the cost of that resource, whether it's a combined cycle, a CT, a solar asset, a new nuclear asset. It looks at the capital cost of that resource and calculates a economic carrying charge. Economic carrying charge is effectively the cost of that resource over the life of the asset and factors in the deferral of that asset. So if I were to select a resource in 2029 compared to 2028, it would factor in the economic benefit for deferring the selection of that asset 1 year. So this is a common practice. It's something that's regularly put into all of our planning models. It has been across all time of my experience doing the IRP, which takes those costs and spreads them out on a representation of deferred asset. What a PPA resource here in this discussion is talking about taking the cost of that resource and making a flat representation of that cost of that resource over the life of the asset, rather than how the companies look at it as a deferred cost of the resource from 1 year to another through an economic carrying charge. So the way that the companies have utilized this is taking the same underlying costs that are used in the company's base portfolios and converted that, instead of an economic carrying charge, into a levelized cost of energy. So instead of the model assessing the capital cost of this resource and the capacity that it receives, it is instead considering the dollar per megawatt hour of energy produced. So for solar assets, the way that we model them, whether it's in the way that the companies plan this portfolio as a base planning assumption, or as a PPA resource, it has the same operating characteristics, so it's going to generate the same. So those costs, whether you model it as a economic carrying charge or a levelized cost of energy, from a present value of revenue requirement, so the total cost of that resource over the life of the asset is going to present value back to the same cost. So what is being assessed here is how does accounting for this resource differently change the selection of resources? And that's really not what this was originally intended to do. And especially because the underlying cost used for the two different scenarios is the same underlying cost. Going back to where this was originally proposed by the ORS, is that the ORS contended that there were lower cost resources that were available, and that to assess those lower cost resources, to use a proxy of, I believe it was $38 per megawatt hour, and that was consistent with a previous procurement of renewable energy that had been seen at one point in time. As we went forward, we discovered, that's not a good assumption. We updated it. It's now the costs and solar resources that we're seeing in our procurements is very close to the generic resource costs that we're modeling in our plan. The ORS recognizes that, so that the difference here is really accounting, and rather than what the intention is there a lower cost option for that same resource that's available in the market? We don't believe there is, and that this distinction, this modeling effort is really causing more confusion than it is clarity. I will say that the companies do perform these modeling sensitivities of higher and lower resource costs. So from that perspective, if solar has a higher cost or solar has a lower cost, we are taking that into consideration and how that changes resource selections. But simply changing the accounting structure of a resource to see if it would accelerate or delay the selection of resources really gets on an inconsistent basis with how we evaluate all the other resources on a deferred value of the resource or deferred cost of the resource.
Let me ask you a question. If the company were to acquire PPA-related solar, how does the company get paid back from the ratepayers or the customers for those costs?
I believe the purchase power agreement solar goes through the fuel rider. That's probably appropriately addressed by witness Bateman.
Okay, and do you know if through the fuel rider the company receives a weighted average cost of capital on top of that?
I'm not aware.
Okay, if the company owns the solar, do you know if that goes into the company's rate base?
I believe it would.
Okay, and if it's in the company's rate base, they would likely receive a weighted average cost of capital on top of that. Would you agree?
What do you mean by weighted average cost of capital?
So, I mean a return on the rate base that the utility owns.
I think there's options on how that cost gets incorporated into rates. I'm sure witness Bateman can speak to that. Traditionally, I think company-owned assets have been included in rate base on a depreciating asset basis, but I'm not aware of a structure that's not that's the only way to do it. So I would limit my response to I'm not familiar with all the ways that a resource can make it into the recovery of that resource.
Is the generic modeling that you do on the solar, is it more akin to a company-owned scenario, or is it more akin to a PPA scenario based on this sort of LCOE?
I would say it doesn't factor in. It's really neither. The modeling, as I mentioned, looks at this economic carrying charge, which is the cost of that resource, factoring in the deferral of the resource for future assets. And my understanding is that base rates, company-owned assets, are in there on a depreciation expense basis, so that recovery gets, and I'm getting a little bit out over my skis here, but witness statement I'm sure can clean this up. But I would say that my understanding is that the way that we model it to identify the least cost resources is slightly different than both of the options that you've put up here of a depreciating rate base and rates and levelized cost of energy as a proxy for a PPA.
So the modeling that the company has done, well, let me back up for a second. What's PVRR?
Yeah. PVRR is the present value of revenue requirements. So this is the revenue requirement is the cost to operate the system. It factors in all the production costs of the system. So what's the fuel? What's the operating cost, variable and fixed for new assets we include. And then it also factors in the economic carrying charge of those resources. So this is the overall annual requirements over time, and then the present valuing of those revenue requirements, of those annual revenue requirements, is brought back to 2024 to represent decisions into the future. Our deferral of resources, essentially, or deferral of costs, have different impacts when you weight that out into time.
And obviously there are lots of inputs and or outputs that you compare when you assess various portfolios, but is PVRR an important thing to look at when balancing which portfolio may be the most reasonable and prudent?
Yeah, it's certain. It's an industry standard to use present value of revenue requirements as a cost metric to portfolios. It's our primary way of looking at cost. We look at cost other ways as well. But I would say that to the looking at the way to represent resource costs here, when you introduce different accounting methodologies, you're really distorting the economic representation of those resources and making that present value of revenue requirement less reliable, in my opinion.
Okay, but the way that you're currently modeling it, does your calculation of the cost at all take into account at all rate-based treatment of the solar assets?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
The way that you've modeled in your modeling system, and you have your generic solar request, and so the model selects the solar based on the economics of it. As a part of that economic factoring or modeling, does that take into account any sort of return on rate base associated with the new generating assets in the solar?
Yes, it does. It uses the company's weighted average cost of capital to assess what is the return required for equity and what's the return required for debt in building these resources. I will say those same numbers are used in calculating the company's LCOE that's used in the PPA modeling that was done here. So it's actually factored into both.
So you're saying within the LCOE, it includes rate base. The LCOE amount includes some sort of rate base within that calculation.
It includes recovery of the debt and equity portions the same way that we factor that into the economic carrying charge that's used in the modeling.
Okay, so if you instead used PPA, which does not have any sort of return on the debt and equity of this, would that affect the LCOE? Would that lower the LCOE by taking out a cost?
I would say that whatever the asset is going to be, there's going to be a return of the costs that are needed to build that, right? Equity and debt. So to that extent, we are treating these units equivalently, that on a levelized cost of energy basis or on a economic carrying charge basis, the cost to build and construct these resources and the capital up front that's needed is factored into the cost.
Okay, but I think maybe we're talking past each other, but I believe you've agreed with me that if a PPA selection of solar applies, there would be no return on it. It would go through the fuel clause, correct?
I think the distinction here is in actual procurements, costs are presented to us on typically on a dollar per kW, or excuse me, dollar per megawatt hour basis. That number that's presented to us for that bid, and my understanding, again, I'm not the expert on solar RFPs, that cost already contains the third party's financing costs to put that resource, to recover that cost from the companies for the energy that they're delivering, to pay the debt, to pay the equity portions of their construction of that solar resource. And the ORS has found that the number that we used for this levelized cost of energy for the solar PPA resource is generally consistent with the solar RFP costs, the dollar per megawatt hour cost that we've used, or that we've received in the most recent solar RFP.
Okay, but the ORS does have disagreement with you through recommendation E2 that, I think we believe, it says ORS recommends Duke Energy comply with Commission Order 2023-189 to model both company-owned and power purchase agreement solar as selectable resource options and not arbitrarily limit that selection in the 2025 IRP update. You would agree we at least disagree on that issue?
Yes, we disagree.
Okay. I think you talked, when we first spoke earlier this, afternoon, we talked about some of the laws and various things that you look toward for the modeling bases. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Is one of those laws the North Carolina law, House Bill 951? Are you generally familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay, and so one of the requirements under House Bill 951 is certain treatment of ownership of generating assets in North Carolina, or for North Carolina regulated utilities. Would you agree?
That's my understanding.
Okay, and you'd agree with me that the general default rule, make sure I've got the right piece pulled up here. The general default rule is that the company shall own all generating assets, and then there's a couple of exceptions to that. You agree?
I believe there's one exception for solar.
Okay. I think there may be another for demand side, but that's okay. We're on the same page. So one of the exceptions is subsection B, and this is the one you mentioned. There is an exception. Could you explain to me what your understanding of that exception is?
I'm going to pull it up on my, give me a moment here.
I can try and zoom in too if it would help. Okay, so would you agree with me that in general that restriction states, and it's late Friday, so tell me if I've got it backwards, but the company is to own 55% of the total megawatts AC of solar energy facilities, and they can procure from 45% from others? Do I have that right?
That appears to be correct.
Okay, do you think that would be a further modeling restriction that you'd have to put in place if you were to include modeling for the PPA?
I don't think so. So I'll take a step back here and kind of focus again on the purpose of the IRP. We're really looking at a fair evaluation of resources against one another. I'll go back to Commissioner Williams' point on levelized cost of energy. That's a useful tool when comparing similar types of resources. So one solar versus another solar, or one type of frame CT versus a reciprocating engine, both kind of peaking resources. They serve the same purpose, so you might compare LCOEs there. But for different types of resources, understanding the IRP is really seeking to balance the total amount of resources of any given type. So to the extent that the IRP is really looking at how much solar should be included in the portfolio, should solar be included at higher or lower amounts because of the cost of solar, that's squarely within the IRP, and that's something that we do evaluate. This continues to cloud and confuse the point of the IRP, which is the total volumes of those resources selected.
And I'd like to add a point of clarity that might help. Even in that case, in North Carolina, we had other parties doing modeling. Even with that requirement, no one modeled two different types of solar, PPA versus utility owned. It was understood by the people doing modeling, not just the company, that ownership structure or financing, how you finance solar or how the ownership is not an input variable into an IRP process. That is an after the fact accounting or something that you address in a CPRE proceeding, but as an input into IRPs, even when there's such a mandate, the modeling community beyond just the company does not take and model solar in two different ways. And that included the North Carolina public staff who did their own proprietary modeling, didn't have two separate resource types. So, this is not just the company making this representation. The way that this is modeled is an industry standard that you use a generic resource type irrespective of ownership structure, and you do a cost, including return of and on. We use the company's cost of equity and debt as a proxy for the cost of return. Each individual entity may have slightly different weighted average costs of capital, but you can't have one generic resource that has one cost of capital and another generic, same exact resource with another. By default, the model will always select the one that's 1 basis point cheaper. And it'll just say that one is the best all the time. And then your IRP devolves into who has the lower cost of capital. And that is not the purpose of an IRP proceeding, is to debate whether you should have ownership structures. It's what resources are needed in what volumes over what period of time, not who owns or who finances those resources. And that's just a standard industry practice. It was demonstrated in that case, and so this is not something that I just wanted to provide clarity on. This is not something the companies are unique in doing.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Mr. Quinto, back to you. Are you aware of any North Carolina commission orders that requested the modeling of PPA versus non-PPA solar?
Not to my direct knowledge.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Going on in your rebuttal testimony, let's see. I think this was, we have already covered this. I think you stated that the companies also view the question of competitiveness of various ownership structures as more appropriate to be addressed in the context of executing the IRP, such as a procurement process or something like that. Is that
Yes,
roughly what you said?
That's what my testimony says.
Okay, and so just to sort of put a bow on that issue, the NTAP here with the supplemental resources, and this is from, I think, Mr. Snyder's supplemental direct that we've all been using. You're currently targeting, 6,460 megawatts by 2031. Is that right?
That's the amount to be procured, yes.
Yeah, and that's based on the P3 fall-based portfolio selection.
It is.
Okay, and then there's some NTAP dates and some requirements of procurement. You agree?
It's how we would expect to procure those resources over the 24 through 26 timeframe.
Okay, but you and the company are not requesting any sort of pre-approval for any of the costs associated with that in this docket, correct?
I think the companies have made that clear.
Could I have a yes or no, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. I think we already talked about that. Sorry. Okay. Going to shift gears a little bit here. Actually, briefly, there was a recommendation G2 that was requested by ORS related to benchmarking. And I think that there was some G1. There was some disagreement on G1 benchmarking. ORS recommends Duke Energy perform production cost model benchmark studies every 3 years in conjunction with comprehensive IRPs and report results in the stakeholder working group. Could you explain why the company is against benchmarking?
I would disagree with the phrasing of your statement. I don't think the companies are against benchmarking. I would say that the companies regularly do benchmarking. The recommendation that the ORS has made, I believe, does not provide additional clarity with the results of the IRP. It is a task that really will require significant amount of data to be collected. The way that Dominion Energy has conducted this same recommendation by the ORS in their IRP proceeding involved a very, in my opinion, a very strenuous process of identifying all of the outages that these resources occur over the course of a year. And as a reminder, the companies have hundreds of units that are attached to their system. It needs to do very complex assessments of cost, of fuels, of outages, of economic purchases, and all of this effort to ensure that capacity factors or operations of these units are generally in line with where the units have operated in the past. This is something that's readily available if interveners, for some reason, challenge that the expectations of the operations of these units haven't been consistent with what we've seen in the past. And if they haven't, that's actually a great opportunity for the companies to explain that here's what's changed between then and there. But I don't think that the recommendation by the ORS is necessary, as the companies already continue to assess their model every time it's updated to ensure that the results are generally in line with the way that the system operates, leveraging the experience of modelers who have been doing this for decades.
I would add just one important point of clarification too, which is IRPs, as you've heard earlier, are weather normal. So it's that 30-year weather normal average, right? Reality, each year, no year is normal. So this process, by definition, then, would need to try and reconcile what weather difference in reality was different than the weather normal. You know, everything from heating and cooling degree days to how much cloud cover did we have. And so we already file, you know, a 700 to 900 page document in these proceedings. And now we're talking about, let's take each variable and reconcile its weather normal IRP to what happened in a non-weather normal actual year. It was a hot year, it was a cold year. We've heard stories of 5 years of polar vortex. And so that process unto itself is just going to add, you know, what we think is an undue burden to the IRP process, given the fact that Mr. Quinto just spoke about, is each of the inputs that go into the model and all of the outputs are developed carefully based on calibration to history. We give that information to all intervening parties. We show them historical outage rates. We show them historical capacity factors of units. We show them historical loads, historical peaks. Now we're talking about take the entire IRP process and develop a benchmarking practice unto which you have to take the entirety of the outputs and justify each one weather normal versus non-weather normal, which, while potentially doable, would add tremendous, all the way around, you know, this commission's time, interveners' time, the company's time. You know, we need to schedule an extra few days for this hearing because that's what the type of analysis that this could be interpreted as. So it's not that the company is trying to not be transparent. We're happy to provide historic data on our fleet, on our load. We do that regularly. We provide thousands of data requests on that throughout this process. It just seems like a scope and scale that is beyond the intent of the statute in my mind.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Mr. Quinto, do you know if the commission has access to discovery request responses that are provided to ORS?
I believe they do not.
Okay, thank you.
Unless they're put in testimony.
Okay. All right, I'm going to shift focus here, hopefully, I think to my last topic with you, Mr. Quinto. I really appreciate your time today. I'd like to turn my attention to your Duke Energy Carolina's Quinto Rebuttal Exhibit 1, which I think is Exhibit 28 in the record.
I'm there.
Okay, wonderful. And could you just sort of high level explain what this this analysis is meant to reflect?
Certainly. So the my rebuttal exhibit contains some updated modeling that enforces some, as we've talked about today, some constraints specifically around the Clean Air Act, Section 111 final rule finalized by the EPA in May of 2024. This looks at how the companies would meet these emission standards for new combined cycles and CT units, how those restrictions on the resource portfolio could change resource selection, and also how the emissions guidelines and the implementation of a state plan could impact coal retirements from what the company posed in P3 fall base. And what we found after doing this analysis was that the resources shift a little bit up and down, perhaps throughout time, depending on the trajectory of reducing emissions exposure, but the near-term actions that the companies are proposing to pursue under a P3 fall base, we still think whether the rule survives or not, or how it gets implemented or eventually replaced, the near-term actions that the companies are seeking under P3 fall base are still the most reasonable, part of the most reasonable and prudent plan for customers.
Thank you. And Mr. Quinto, I'm not a modeling guy. This stuff is way over my head, so I it's very impressive. I've been trying to simplify this for myself to better sort of understand what we're looking at. And I've got a couple little kids, and so I read fairy tales, and I keep thinking of Goldilocks and the Three Little Bears. And, I think we all agree that P1 and P2 are too aggressive. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that because they are calling for resources that we don't think we can execute on, that poses risks to customers, and executability challenges, certainly something that we need to keep abreast of from a reliability standpoint in delivering these portfolios.
Okay, and so that's why the company picks P3 fall base as the preferred portfolio.
I would say overall the P3 fall base portfolio addresses all of the balancing factors under the IRP statute, from reliability to least cost to commodity price risk, diversity of resources, and foreseeable conditions. I think it's a plan that is most reasonable and prudent.
Okay, and so just sticking with me on my Goldilocks idea here, if I'm Goldilocks walking in, we can agree that P1 and P2, that porridge is too hot. You with me?
I would agree.
Okay. And we ask that to comply with another part of that order that we keep showing, and I'm trying to wrap up so we can get to the weekend, but one of the other requirements there was modeling on something that I think have all been calling P0 together. Would you agree with that?
P0 being the no carbon constraints portfolio. That's
right. And I think in Sir rebuttal testimony, ORS has said that we agree that it's not properly carbon risks or carbon, you can probably say it better than I can, but they're not proper risk adjustments for the carbon issues. Is that fair to say?
I would agree. That's what the ORS says in their report.
And you think P0 does not work either?
I agree. It is not balancing factors under the IRP statute the same way that P3 fall base does.
Okay, so sticking with me with Goldilocks here, we could say that porridge is too cold, right?
I would agree.
Okay, and so the company is here, they're recommending P3 fall base, and as cheesy as this is, the company says that porridge is just right, right?
That is the one that we believe best represents or best balances the factors in the IRP statute.
Okay, and so in this process, who is required to determine what is the most reasonable and prudent plan?
The commission.
Okay, great. So they've got to figure out what is just right, okay? Let's talk about some of this modeling if we could. Let me give you an unhighlighted version to look at. Do you believe that the P3 fall-based portfolio, as it currently sets, can comply with the Clean Air Act?
I would say you can probably put constraints on any portfolio to make it comply with the Clean Air Act if it continues to be a reliable portfolio, or if it is lower cost than others. I would not suspect that. The resources, at least under P3 fall base, are, and what we've really concluded in the sensitivity analysis that we've performed here, is that those same set of resources are robust, whether the Clean Air Act Section 111 final rule remains in place, or if that goes away. It's the same set of resources. They operate differently, obviously. It costs differently based on the utilization of these resources. There may be some nuances to coal retirements based on a state implementation plan, but we believe that what we've put forward today, or what we've put forward in this plan, provides the Commission with a resource plan that really does address those, and how a resource plan operates, given on constraints, may change, but they are very similar in terms of the types of resources and the amounts of resources.
Okay. And so here we're looking at subsection, I think that this is 6, if I'm reading my Roman numerals right. And under subsection A, P3 fall base and the CAA rule scenario. So this is applying P3 fall base to the Clean Air Act scenario. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay. And could you read the first sentence of that last paragraph for me?
Beginning with the results of
Yes, sir.
the results of this production cost run illustrated a failure to achieve the interim target by 2035 under the final rule, as introduced in section. Oh, I'm sorry, just the first sentence.
That is just fine. Thank you. And so, am I reading that correctly, or are you reading? Am I hearing that correctly? That under the Clean Air Act rule scenario, the company would be unable to achieve their North Carolina interim target by 2035.
That's correct.
Okay. ORS asked for the company to do some additional modeling, did they not?
There have been several iterations where the ORS has requested additional modeling from the companies.
And I believe someone talked about this yesterday, that some additional modeling was done, but some other additional modeling was not done. Is that a fair statement?
There have been requests from the ORS that the companies were able to complete, and there's some that the companies did not.
Okay. Did the ORS did not ask the companies to run the Clean Air Act modeling, did they?
I believe they recommended that it be performed by the 2025 IRP update.
Sure, and that was probably a bad question, but not for today in the hearing room. We didn't ask for it to be run ahead of the hearing.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yes.
And so this is sort of jumping around here. This is page 4 of your supplemental analysis. What am I looking at here?
So this table is the portfolio matrix for the sensitivity analysis. We have very similar tables included in the initial plan and in the supplemental planning analysis. What you see down the left side is the portfolio name. Across the top are different types of primary constraints or major constraints or assumptions that are used in across the IRP. And then filling out that matrix is for each of those specific portfolios, what was the assumption with respect to each of these different IRP modeling assumptions.
Okay, great. And so I'm just going to highlight, I think this is, let's see, we got 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Is that 13 or 13 plus the P3 fall base? So 14 total on this chart. Am I counting right?
I believe there's 14 here, but the P3 fall base.
Right.
Yes,
So
that's
1
correct.
plus 13. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. So we got P3 fall base up top. And then I just want to turn your attention to, I think, 2 of these we're going to talk about a little bit more. I've got P3 CAA Rule 2037. And so is it my, or correct me if I'm wrong, this is running P3 fall base with the interim carbon constraint target from North Carolina kicked out to 2037. Is that right?
Yes, it changes the trajectory to achieve the interim target by 2037.
Okay, and so but that's the primary difference between the two portfolios.
With the caveat that this portfolio has the constraints in developing the portfolio
Sure.
of the Clean Air Act rules.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay, and then one other one to look at here. The P3 CAA Rule 2038, no OSW. What is no OSW?
OSW stands for offshore wind. So in this portfolio, the companies did not allow the selection of offshore wind until after the base planning period, so outside of the 15-year planning horizon. This is actually consistent with some of the modeling the companies have done in the initial plan to show impacts to the portfolio if offshore wind was not available on the time frame that was analyzed in the initial plan or the supplemental planning analysis.
Okay. And when it comes to the final rule, and let's see, the companies will have to implement the Clean Air Act final rule with the local state officials. Is that right?
With respect to the emissions guidelines for the coal units and how the compliance with the guidelines across the state are. That's correct.
Okay, and there's no coal units in South Carolina, correct?
That's correct. None of our coal units are located in South Carolina.
Once again, I appreciate the clarification. You were exactly right. None of yours. Okay. So I'm going to just turn your attention to page 6 here. We've got a little bit more here. So of note, I think it says all existing coal units in DEC and DEP are located in North Carolina and would be subject to a single state plan. So because you don't have any South Carolina coal units, South Carolina wouldn't have anything to do with this RULOF. It would be solely North Carolina. Is that right?
I'm not familiar with the entire process of how a state develops their plan, but my understanding is that the state of North Carolina will develop the plan with respect to the enforcing the emissions guidelines for the assets located in their state. I don't know if that has any consideration for South Carolina.
Okay, but as far as you know, even if there's developments in South Carolina, the DEC DEP coal will not be. It won't be applicable to the DEC DEP coal units.
A state plan in South Carolina would not be applicable to the company's coal assets
Okay.
that are located in North Carolina. That's correct.
Thank you. So I'm trying to navigate a clean and a dirty copy here. Let's see. On page, I'll have you turn to, I think it's page 15 with me. And I believe this came up in earlier testimony this week with someone. This is an updated list of NTAP resources based on the Clean Air Act Section 111 sensitivity analysis. Is that right?
Yes, this table here is a comparison of the NTAP resources that the companies put forward for P3 fall base. And after assessing the Clean Air Act final rule across all of these sensitivities, the companies would continue to recommend approximately the same amounts for all these resources, with the exception for offshore wind, noting some potential flexibility on that resource depending on for that resource to be part of the resource portfolio.
So there are some portfolios that you've run in this list of 13 that may not necessarily require all that offshore wind or maybe even no offshore wind. Is that fair?
Yes, the 2038 no OSW, no offshore wind portfolio did defer the offshore wind ability for the model to select any offshore wind until after the base planning period. So the 15-year planning horizon for that portfolio did not include any offshore wind.
Okay. And there are a few others, correct?
I believe the 2037 base portfolio reduces the amount of, thank you. What page is this?
12. Sorry, I think it's page 12. It's CAA Rule SA 3.
Yes. Thank you for bringing this up. The company's also developed an additional portfolio, P3 Clean Air Act Rule 2037 aggressive SMR, no OSW. And if we were to go back up to the previous spot where we go through the portfolio and the assumptions, you'll see that this portfolio is optimized without allowing the selection of offshore wind in the base planning period, but also assumes a more aggressive deployment modestly from a resource standpoint. I think it accelerates the availability 1 year for a nuclear unit, but does not include any offshore wind in it.
Okay, and this is through 2038 rather than 2035 as well, correct?
Yes, this table is of megawatts through 2038.
Okay, and you would agree with me that every one of these scenarios still allows the company to fully retire its coal by 2038?
With the exception of Cliffside 6 not retiring but converting to natural gas, that's correct.
Okay, well, okay, so but all of them allow you to retire a total of 8,445 megawatts of coal.
Yes, that's correct.
So I really need a level there. So let's see here. Looking at P3 Clean Air Act Rule 2037 base, we talked about this one in detail already, right? That one only needs 1,600 megawatts of wind. Is that right?
Yes, that portfolio selects 1,600 megawatts.
Okay. And then we've got P3 Clean Air Act 2037 high CCCT cost. Is that where the CCs and CTs are on the higher end of costs to be built?
Yeah, what we did with this is take the capital costs of CC and CC combined cycle and CT combustion turbine resources and increase their costs by 25%. This was really to assess, with the additional restrictions on the operability of these units, are they even still selected with a higher cost? And we did see that. But as a result, to your point, it does change the selection of offshore wind a bit here as well and reduces that to 1,600 megawatts.
Okay, and remind me, we were talking earlier, when you combine the Total and the Synergy group, what does the website, the Duke Energy website say you can have capacity for on a megawatt basis or gigawatt basis?
I believe it was a fact sheet, and I believe it said 3 gigawatts.
So 3,000 here, so plenty of capacity.
Yes, 3,000 megawatts. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, sorry, yep. And so if you looked at, or if you remember from the Duke Energy website, we talked about how much just the Duke affiliated, unregulated affiliated entity, Synergy Energy, how many megawatts did the Duke Energy website say they had the capacity to build out?
I believe it was 1,600 megawatt, or yes, 1,600 megawatts.
Okay, and so that would match these two here, correct?
Those numbers do match.
And it does not match these three.
It does not.
Okay, and then let's go to the last two. We got P3 CAA Rule 2037 aggressive SMR, no offshore wind. That one obviously has 0 offshore wind, right?
That's correct.
But this requires that the SMR technology actually come online. Is it a year earlier?
I believe in the supplemental planning analysis we discuss, the first resource coming online is planned for the beginning of year 2034. The way that the companies have modeled this is instead of representing one resource in 34 and a second resource in 35, we said both of those resources would be available in 2035. Part of this aggressive SMR case is to say we would assume that first resource would be available in 2034, the second one in 2035. It also increases or accelerates the first unit at a second site. I believe there was some discussion about that yesterday on how new resources would be brought onto the system. So that's where in the nuclear column you see 2,400 megawatts by 2038 rather than 2,100 selected in the other portfolios.
Okay, and Mr. Quinto, I'm not trying to be difficult, but it's late Friday. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Would you agree with me that this is page 9? I think it says the aggressive SMR availability assumptions assume the first unit is available at the beginning of 2034, a whole year earlier?
Yes, that's what I explained.
Okay, I believe you'd said 2035 for 2 units.
The base assumption would be 2035 for 2 units. In the aggressive SMR case, we allowed for that acceleration of the first unit 1 year.
Okay,
so
great.
it's still cumulatively 2 by 2035, but the first unit is available a year earlier.
Sure, and I just want to make sure that we were on the same page for the record.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you for that.
Okay, and then just jumping back to this table one more time. So here we're at the, let's see, P3 CAA rule 2038, no offshore wind. Once again, we're retiring all that same coal, correct?
Yes, sir.
And we have the same amount of SMR, correct?
Correct.
And we've got the same amount of pump storage, correct?
Yes.
And same with onshore wind.
Correct.
And same with CT.
Correct.
Little bit less than fall base. Sorry. So, but the same through these various scenarios.
Yes, and it's a slightly different assumption that we used for the sensitivity analysis. So fewer CTs were able to be selected at the same cost. So that's that minor difference.
Right. And so same CCs. That's fall base 6,800.
Correct.
And in fact, there's a bit more battery and there's a bit more solar. You'd agree?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Okay. Just one moment, please. I'm going to check my notes. I got, I think, 1 or 2 more things, and then I can wrap up. Oh, we're getting close to 3. I need to hurry up. Okay, I think we talked about how it's important to evaluate what the PVRRs are for plans. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So what am I looking at here? This is P3 fall base SPA. That is the P3 fall portfolio with the supplemental planning analysis, correct?
That's correct.
And that is the version of the plan that the company is seeking the commission's approval of as the most reasonable and prudent, correct?
It is.
Okay, and so am I reading this right? This is DEC, DEP, and then combined Carolinas, is that right?
That's correct.
And I don't see it here, but these are numbers in the billions, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and so I would be reading this correctly by saying that in the Carolinas by 2038, the P3 fall base, based on your modeling assumptions, would be a PVRR of $77.9 billion. Is that correct?
Yeah, and again, I'll just point out from a present value of revenue requirement, this is the cost to operate the system, so it's not just new resources. It's a fraction of the cost of the new resources as that cost is spread out over the life of the asset, but also the cost to operate the system, the fuel, the operations costs, the maintenance costs. So that's all factored in as well.
Okay, great. But I appreciate that clarification. So we got 77.9 billion here, and then in 2050, that obviously this is another, what is this, 12 years going down the road. We're up to 149 billion all in based on the modeling, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, let's revisit just briefly 2 of those scenarios. So we talked a little bit about how P3 CAA Rule 2037 only required 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, correct?
Correct.
And it still allowed for all of the coal to be retired, correct?
Correct.
The difference was just that it goes out to 2037 for the interim target in North Carolina.
That's correct.
Okay. And so in 2038, based on your modeling, this would actually be $800 million cheaper on a PVRR. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
And same thing for 2050. This would be another, same thing, $800 million cheaper. You agree?
On a present value.
On a PVRR basis.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And that doesn't mean that's what this will cost, right? I mean, this is extrapolated out 15, 20 years. I mean, like in real dollars, we're talking about maybe double, triple this as inflation. And this is a present value of money exercise, correct?
That's correct.
So it's not actual cash.
Pause for the phrase actual cash. It is a present value representation of future costs. So discounted.
It's not nominal.
Right. And
Not
so
nominal.
it
Thank
would
you.
be fair to understand that by 2050, assume the modeling is perfect and we've got a wonderful crystal ball, and Mr. Quinto, you're the best modeler that we've ever seen. $148.2 billion. That by then you may actually spend $400 billion. You may be exactly right, but that's that difference in the current value of that money. Is that fair?
That's the right way to categorize it.
Okay, perfect. And so then just one last one here. So we got P3 CAA Rule 2038, no onshore wind. And so I think what we can glean from these additional supplemental portfolio runs you've done is it seems that the longer we're able to extend the interim target in North Carolina out, it may decrease the costs overall of the program. Would you agree with that?
It's one consideration. Yes, you're by slowing the fact that you're hedging against risks of these emissions, that would result in a deferral or fewer resources selected and have an impact on the present value revenue requirements.
Okay, and so then if we just look now at P3 CAA rule, no off 2038, so that's interim target kicked out to 2038, no offshore wind, right?
Yes.
In 2038, the PVRR drops to 76.5 billion. Is that right?
Yes.
Help me with that math. How much less is that than P3 fall base?
Math on the stand. 1.4 billion.
That's right, 1.4 billion, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And that's present value again. So in nominal cash, maybe it's going to be bigger. All right, let's go to 2050 and just wrap this up. 147.2 billion. How much less is that than 149?
1.8.
Okay, so if you were to select or run this scenario based on your modeling outputs, you would not have to have any offshore wind, correct?
There's no offshore wind in this portfolio. That's correct.
And it would be almost $2 billion cheaper than the P3 fall base. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you recall from the testimony yesterday that ORS has certain concerns about the time, not the assets themselves, but the timeline of bringing those assets on for offshore wind and for SMR technology? Does that sound right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No other questions? I believe Mr. Torrey had one or two for Mr. Snyder.
I'm wondering if the company has any redirect. Oh, you want through?
Mr. Chair, I do have just a few for Mr. Snyder, but given the hour, obviously at your wish.
It is 3 o'clock. When you say just a few, you mean 5 minutes or?
Literally 5 minutes.
Let's do that.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I promise you I will try to be a man of my word and get us out of here in a expedited manner. Mr. Snyder, you note in your direct testimony that you are managing director of Carolina's Integrated Resource Planning and Analytics for Duke Energy. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And your duties cover integrated resource planning in both South Carolina and North Carolina.
They do.
Did you participate in the biennial consolidated carbon plan and integrated resource plans of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress that remains pending before the North Carolina Utilities Commission?
Yes.
Mr. Austin is handing you a document, Mr. Snyder, and it should be the one here that is going to be shown on the Elmo here in just a second. And you may actually turn, you don't really need to worry about the letter, but if you go to the second page of it, this appears to be a verified second amended petition for approval of 2023 through 2024 carbon plan and integrated resource plans of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress LLC, filed with the North Carolina Utilities Commission on April 30th, 2024. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And you see that it is a verified second amended petition, correct?
Yes.
And you actually verified the second amended petition, did you not?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Chair, I'd ask that the verified second amended petition be marked for identification and entered into the record as the next hearing exhibit, please.
Mr. Chairman.
This will be marked for identification and entered into the record as exhibit
Chairman.
number 31.
Before you rule, I would continue our objection to the relevance of a North Carolina hearing exhibit being entered into the record. This is something that's beyond the scope of the standards the Commission applies under the IRP statute to consider this IRP in South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, if I may briefly, as you've heard incessantly from the company, they run a dual state system. So they dual plan. Mr. Snyder signed the verification of this document. If he's not the proper person to ask about the contents, I don't know who is.
Well, we are trying this case under South Carolina law,
I understand.
and I don't think we get into the legal part of it. I'm going to overrule the objection.
Mr. Snyder, would you please turn to page 22 for me?
I'm there.
Do you see the heading V?
I see it.
Could you please read that?
The heading
Yes,
says
sir.
request for assurances of future recoverability of significant development costs of zero carbon generation additions.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Snyder. That's all I have.
Thank you. It's kind of an odd thing that we had agreed that we would end at 3 o'clock, and I know you may have some redirect.
Yes, sir. We would have some redirect including on this new exhibit potentially. So, yeah, if commissioners have questions, we'd be glad for the hearing or the panel to be available on Monday if that pleases the commission.
Okay, it's just, you know, I'm sorry we were having to break up the middle of your presentation, and I would instruct the witnesses, you're under oath, so you cannot talk to your attorneys over the weekend. I'm sure the attorneys will come up with some good questions by themselves.
Thank you for that, Chair Powers.
Also, the commission questions, which will come before that will be on Monday as well. That's what we'll start out.
Sounds like a plan, Chair. Thank you.
All right. Can we start at 9:30 on Monday?
Chair Powers. This is Kate Mixon for
Yeah.
States
okay.
and all. I believe that Ms. Clancy and Mr. Gooding may be appearing virtually next week, and so we just wanted to ask the chair's permission for them to do so. I will still be here in person.
They'll be missed, but they certainly can.
Thank you.
And Chair Powers, this is Dorothy Jaffe on behalf of Sierra Club. I also would request that I be able to participate virtually next week. I have some childcare constraints that don't allow me to fly back, if that's okay with the commission.
Been there, done that.
Yeah.
You got it.
Thank you.
Anything else we need to address very quickly? If the attorneys could hold out 1 minute, we got issues about scheduling on next week that Ms. Wessinger Hill would like to speak to you about. I think it would only affect Duke and ORS. It says to a fuel case we had next week. Yeah, but everybody needs to be here because of the scheduling. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.